The Chemical Foundation of Life, Chapter 2, Part 2. Here's an example of the periodic table of elements. It contains every element found on Earth, plus a few that have been created in the laboratory. Notice that elements are grouped by different color codes. These are families of elements. The legend that tells you which family each element belongs to is in the lower right-hand corner. Each little square with the symbol for each element in the middle of the square is surrounded by some numbers. In the upper left-hand corner is the atomic number, telling you how many protons and electrons are in that particular element. And underneath the abbreviation or symbol for the element is the relative atomic mass, which, depending upon the resource, could be simply the mass of protons and neutrons. Below that is the actual name of the element. So all the information a person could possibly need can be found on this periodic table when we're trying to understand elements and some of their different characteristics. When we take a look at an atom of a particular element, remember we mentioned that the characteristics of an element are identified or defined by the number of protons. But remember, the number of electrons is going to equal the number of protons in a neutrally charged atom of any element. And so let's learn a little bit more about the electrons, because it's the electrons that are so important in biological systems that allow the structures of organisms to interact with one another. Not all electrons are essentially equal in energy. They occupy different energy levels. And ideally, electrons normally exist at the lowest available energy level, also called a shell. If we take a look at the illustration on the right-hand side, it's an example of an atom of hydrogen. And notice we have 3 concentric rings around the atomic nucleus for hydrogen, and an electron is represented by a little blue sphere in a circle that's labeled 1n. The n designates a particular energy level, and in this illustration we have a 1n energy level, and then a 2n and a 3n. With electrons filling their shells, and that's what they do when we look at different atoms, we're going to find, depending upon the element, they're going to have different numbers of electrons, corresponding, of course, to the number of protons. The outermost energy level, also called energy shell, is called the valence shell. This is the area in the electrons that are going to allow that particular atom of that element to interact with other atoms. The most stable configuration for any atom of any element is when the valence shell has every position occupied by an electron. Not all energy levels may contain the same number of electrons. The first shell, or energy level, you see has 2 electrons that occupy that level. The next outermost ring, the 2n, will be satisfied in terms of being full of the appropriate number of electrons. Second, or 2n level, or shell, will have 8 electrons. The 3n will also have 8. Whenever you see that we have atoms of elements with completely appropriately filled electron shells, or valence shells, if they're containing for 1n 2 electrons, or for 2n and 3n 8 electrons, those are going to be very stable atoms of elements and not very interactive. We call those the rule of octet, that have 8 that satisfy their electron positions or filling of that valence shell. And elements in the family or the group numbered 18 is where we find very stable types of elements called the noble gases. But the question always comes up, okay, where are the electrons? Well, the electron orbitals can be described by mathematical equations. Scientists have tried a variety of physics experiments, and we can, at any point in time, find those electrons, so to speak, but really, in truth, if we're going to try and describe it all the time, we can't do that. Instead, Erwin Schrödinger in 1926 described mathematical equations that gave us an idea of the probability of where an electron might be. In fact, when we get into the subatomic world of structures that are used to create atoms, there's essentially a whole different series of rules and laws that these structures seem to obey. And in fact, now we're getting into a realm of the atom where we can see that how things work in those tiny subatomic particles or pieces of an atom use what we now interpret or call the quantum mechanical model of an atom. Electrons and protons really don't behave sort of the way we think they should or do. It's very difficult for human beings to really fathom or understand what's really going on in this amazing world within the atom. But we have to try, because that's how we learn how the real world works. The mathematical quantum mechanical models can predict an area known as an orbital where an electron is most likely to be roughly 90% of the time. And in fact, there are areas that surround the atomic nucleus where an electron just will never be located. How does that look? Well, we call them orbitals. And we need to understand where those orbitals might be and where the electrons are in the orbitals, because again, for biological systems, it's the electrons that help atoms of either the same or different element to interact with one another and eventually create structures like plants and animals. Here we have an illustration of some of the different kinds of orbitals, what are often described as subshells, of particular different atoms. And remember, we talked about shells or energy levels, like the valence shell. But within the valence shell, and we look at those mathematical models for quantum mechanics, they're not nice, sort of neat spheres. Instead, we see some interesting shapes, or interesting sort of subsets of geometric structures where the electrons are most likely going to be located. The subshell's unique shapes are all given letter designations. Each subshell has a specific number of orbitals within which we can find pairs of electrons, and the SPDF is sort of the way that scientists, chemists, and physicists especially designate these different energy levels. The S subshapes are spherical and has one orbital. The P subshells are dumbbell-shaped and has 3 orbitals, going in an X, Y, and Z axis. So we have this very interesting, almost flower-like shape, very three-dimensional, and not at all what human beings would envision originally, where we'd expect electrons to be. Here's another illustration using quantum mechanical models to describe where an electron would be. The fuzzy areas are the probability distribution shells and orbitals where electrons are most likely going to be found. The little nodes that we see in between the different colored bits are actually areas where electrons have 0 probability of being found. Now, interestingly enough, different physics experiments can be performed that illustrate that electrons have properties of particles and properties of waves. Protons do the same thing on a much different scale. We call sometimes those unique structures wave particles because different mathematical models and different ways that we analyze these subatomic particles show these results. Sometimes when we're working with them, we see that they have wave properties, and you can kind of see with those different rings or different fuzzy areas of density how we might sort of correlate that with different properties of a wave. Here's an example of scandium. Scandium has an atomic number of 21. And if you get a chance, run this video. The URL is linked in the regular PowerPoint that accompanies this video. You'll see that it has sort of layer upon layer of globular shaped spherical orbitals and dumbbell orbitals, eventually creating layer upon layer of electron orbitals to occupy or accommodate 21 electrons. When we're talking about interacting substances, whether we're looking at just straight plain old general chemistry, chemical reactions, or if we're talking about chemical reactions within a cell or within organisms, there are formats that scientists use to describe what's happening. For a chemical reaction, starting materials are called reactants. That's the starting stuff. Then something happens to change those reactants into what we call products. That's what happens when we transform the reactants into something else. For example, this chemical equation, we have on the left-hand side of the arrow the reactants, which are 2 molecules of hydrogen peroxide. On the right-hand side, we have the products, which would be 2 molecules of water, H2O, plus oxygen. And we often say molecular oxygen because it's actually in the form of a gas. So H2O2, hydrogen peroxide, can break down or undergo a chemical reaction that leads to the product of 2 water molecules and some oxygen in the form of a gas. The illustration with peroxide producing the products of water and oxygen is illustrated as an irreversible reaction. In other words, the chemical reaction only proceeds in one direction until all the reactants are used up. Sometimes, however, chemical reactions are reversible. The nomenclature or the notation that's used for those kinds of reactions has an arrow that's pointing in 2 directions. Reactants are converted to products, but some of the products, or maybe all of the products, can be converted back to reactants. Here we have on the left an example of carbonic acid, or I should say bicarbonate, on the left, and hydrogen ions, and we'll talk about ions later, but we have bicarbonate on the left with hydrogen ions leading to production of carbonic acid. The carbonic acid, on the other hand, can also go in the reverse direction to produce bicarbonate and some hydrogen ions. This is actually a chemical reaction that's quite important in human and even animal blood. And we'll talk about, or you might hear about, those types of reactions in other courses, as well as possibly this one.